Great. Thanks for coming, everyone. So my name is Alicia Calzada. I'm MPPA's Deputy General Counsel. I help our members with legal issues and help advocate for photographers in various ways, courts, legislature, other needs. And so I'm here to welcome you to the MPPA Live Master Your Gear Canon R Series event. Tonight, we're going to be taking a deep dive into setting up your Canon R Series camera. We have two guests tonight. First, we have Jake Cannon, who's a photojournalist for WHAS 11 News. Jake is a photojournalist in Louisville, Kentucky at WHAS. His first ever camera was a Canon Rebel T6, and he's been a Canon user ever since. He uses his Canon EOS R to film news stories in Louisville, and he also uses it for freelance gigs such as weddings, portraits, and anything in between. So Jake will be able to provide great perspective on his Canon EOS R camera. Also joining us is Tony Kurdzig, our Canon USA Senior Pro Market Rep. Tony joined Canon USA in 2015 as a pro market rep for the Northeast region. He primarily provides support for the photojournalism community, including major national agencies such as Getty Images, Thomson Reuters, European Press Photo Agency, in addition to both large and small newspapers, and also freelance photojournalists. He's also a part of the Canon professional services staff that regularly attends major events like the Super Bowl, the US Open, both the golf and the tennis, national political conventions, the Olympics, and of course, national and regional trade shows. Tony's an expert in wired and wireless networking of Canon cameras, and also Canon robotics and remote cameras. Just a note, if you have comments or questions, they can be put in the Q&A or the chat. We're going to monitor those, and your thoughts and questions will be shared. So with that, I'm going to pass the Zoom along to Tony. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you very much, Alicia, and thank you to the NPPA, and thank you for everyone for joining us tonight. I want to thank Jake for being sort of my co-host tonight as well. So thank you, Jake, for being here. Tonight, we're going to talk about setting up your R series camera, specifically the R5 and the R6. They've been out for not quite a year now, and they've become really, really popular in the journalism market over the last year. The EOS R that Jake uses has had fairly good saturation, but the R5 and R6 have become really, really popular with photojournalists. So we're going to talk about setting up these cameras. I've spent a lot of time over the last year on the phone with people, walking them through exactly what I'm going to do tonight. So hopefully this will help you folks that either have an R5 or an R6, or a lot of what we're going to go over also applies to the R and even the RP. Or if you're sort of on the fence about buying an R5 or an R6, and you're here to sort of just get more information about that, you'll pick up a lot as we go through the features of the camera. I just want to remind everyone that Stingray is going to be monitoring the chat and the Q&A. So please, if you have any questions, feel free to post them in there, and Stingray will interrupt me and put your question out there.
Yep. And I will interrupt you right now because Dan Johnson says you're looking good.
Thank you very much, Dan. He and I were texting last night. I didn't take your advice. That's an inside joke, and he'll know what I mean by that, but thank you. So please, anyone, interject questions or comments, even if it's something that just popped into your head that I'm not specifically talking about right now. I'm happy to go over all of that. Before we get started, Jake, did you want to say anything about your experiences shooting with the EOS R? And you've had an R5 for a couple of days to sort of prime for this night tonight. So do you have any comments you want to throw in right in the beginning here?
Yeah, I haven't had a lot of hands-on time with the R5, but I used it today, and I was so impressed by the autofocus system. I was shooting it 1.2 from aperture for an interview, and it just held focus. Like, I was so impressed. I would use it as a B camera. And then I love this RF glass, the full frame sensor. It's just really beautiful image.
Yeah, so that's the RF 50mm 1.2, which if you have experience with the EF version of that lens, the RF version is just a whole nother level above and beyond the EF in terms of autofocus performance and image quality. It's incredibly sharp, even wide open, even in the corners. It's just really impressive. So I'm going to switch my camera over to my alternate camera that's going to show the back of my R5. And we're going to use this view for most of the evening. So I'm just going to jump in and start talking about setting up and using this camera. So before we dive into the menus, I just want to go over some general uses in terms of making changes to the camera. You know, one of the first questions I always get is, how do you set the ISO on this camera? Because they're, you know, unlike you're used to, you know, our 1D series or the 5D series, you've got those buttons on the top of the camera for ISO and white balance and things like that. So that's not here on the R5 in a real mechanical form, but they are represented electronically. So I am going to show how you access those features with the camera with the out of the box settings. So before I started tonight, this camera is reset to full defaults. So if you happen to have a new camera in your hands and you haven't changed any of the settings, it's going to be set the same as mine is right now. So right off the bat, we've got a touch screen. If you haven't figured this out already, anywhere I touch on the screen, that's where the focus point is going to go. And then these little radio buttons on the rear screen, you can touch them. For example, aperture, you can change your aperture and so forth. So ISO is right here. You can set the ISO this way, which is very easy. But if you're used to the buttons on the 1D series and the 5D series, and you want to be able to make changes to things like white balance and ISO and things like that without taking the camera away from your eye, which a lot of times is really important. You need to keep your eye on what you're doing. And so the way you do that is by pressing the little tiny MFN or multifunction button that's up next to the shutter button. It's in between the shutter button and the main dial on the top of the camera. And when you press that, it brings up sort of a virtual set of buttons. And so these settings represent the buttons that are on top of the 5D series. So I've got my ISO, I've got my drive mode, my autofocus mode, my white balance, flash exposure compensation. So I'm switching in between these by turning the secondary control dial on the top of the camera. This is on the R and the R5, it's the dial that surrounds the mode button on the top of the camera. So if I hit multifunction, I can scroll to which option I want. And then if I turn the main dial on the top of the camera, I can then affect the change in that function. So ISO is there. I can change my drive mode this way. So this is possible either through the view screen like we're doing it right now, or with the camera up to your eye. So this is a real easy way to make those changes without taking the camera away from your eye. The other way to make major quick changes to the camera is with the Q button on the back of the camera. So there's the Q button right above the main control dial, but there's also a virtual Q button here on the rear screen. So pressing that brings up a menu like this, and I can go through and pick what option I want to change just using the touch screen this way. So either by the Q button on the back of the camera or the Q button on the rear screen. Those give you quick access to some of the main features like drive mode and white balance and autofocus mode. So a couple of different ways to get at those settings really easily, whether the camera is up to your eye or not. So before we get into the menus, a couple other things on the buttons. On the back top right of the camera is the AF select button. It's the little button that looks like a plus sign that has a box around it. If you press that, that's your AF select button. So like many of the buttons on Canon cameras, this button is sticky. So when I press it, it holds. And now if I press the multifunction button, I can now scroll through my different AF methods, and we're going to talk about what these different ones are when we get into the AF system. But this is, again, another quick way, without taking the camera away from your eye, to select those AF methods really quickly. When we get into the menus also, we can, if we want, turn off some of these AF methods that you maybe don't want to use or are never going to use, so that when you scroll through, you have fewer to scroll through and you can get to the one you want quickly. Like some people just use the face detect plus tracking and then, you know, single point and surround and turn all the others off, and then it makes it faster to jump through those. Okay, so we're going to get into the menu, and I'm going to try and stay specific to things that are about the mirrorless system that are different from the DSLRs. I'm sort of making the assumption that most of the folks on the call tonight have used our DSLRs and are at least fairly familiar with the menu system. So I'm going to try and stick to things that are either new in this camera series or specific to mirrorless. But if there's something that you see on the screen that you have a question about that I skip over, please put that in the Q&A or the chat, and Stingray will interrupt me and we'll get to your question about, you know, what's dual pixel RAW, if that's something you really want to know about. That came out in the 5D4 and the EOS R, so I'm not going to really talk about what dual pixel RAW is, but if somebody really wants to know, please put that in the chat. So right off the bat, I'm just going to go through these sort of in order, starting with the red shoot menu and the first tab. Image quality. Similar to other Canon cameras, we've got RAW and we've got several versions of JPEG, different resolutions. So 45 megapixels, 22 megapixels, 12, and 3.8 megapixels. So this selects your JPEG resolution. And then there's two options for RAW. And I actually get a lot of questions about the difference between RAW and CRAW. Canon calls CRAW compact RAW. You'll see on the internet a lot of people call it compressed RAW. We don't use that term, although we are using a compression algorithm to make the RAW file a little smaller. And so that's really the point of the CRAW, is so that you get a smaller file on your disk, but it still has all of the features and the options and functionality of regular RAW files. So as a general recommendation, I tell folks to use CRAW, because in real practical terms, there is no quality difference between RAW and CRAW. So I recommend folks use CRAW. I'll also point out on the R5 in particular, this cropping mode, because we're starting with a 45 megapixel sensor. If I choose the 1.6 crop mode in this camera, it's going to automatically apply an APS-C size crop to the sensor. But the good news is that on the back end of that, I'm still getting a 17 megapixel file, which is plenty large to do a lot of really good things with. And I'm also applying essentially a 1.6 teleconverter type crop. The other good thing about doing this way is that, unlike adding a 1.4 teleconverter between the lens and the camera, I'm not losing a stop of light. So that means I don't have to run my ISO up another stop. So this mode was pointed out to me really early after the R5 came out by a Getty sports photographer that discovered just how incredibly useful this crop mode is. Because as we all know, this past year, a lot of sports photographers have spent a lot of time photographing from the nosebleeds with a 600 millimeter. And he found this crop mode incredibly useful, particularly on the R5. So for those of you that have the R5 or are considering the R5, that's a really useful mode for sports or anytime you want to get a little more reach out of your lens. Okay, most of these settings are almost identical to our DSLRs. I'll just really quickly gloss over the highlight tone priority and auto lighting optimizer. These functions only affect your JPEGs. These are automatic functions that will either brighten the shadows slightly or bring down the highlights slightly. So the auto lighting optimizer slightly brightens your shadows. The highlight tone priority slightly brings down your highlights. And they only affect the JPEGs, but they do have a pretty decent effect. And the good thing is that the look of them is very, very natural. You really can't tell that either one of these is applied other than the fact that you've got more shadow detail or more highlight detail. So something to play with, something to see whether it works for you. I know a lot of wedding photographers that shoot JPEG enable this highlight tone priority because it holds a lot of highlight in the bride's dresses. So you have two options, D1, a D plus and D+2. That's sort of a medium and heavy application of the highlight tone priority. I will say though that if you enable either of these, it will change the lowest ISO option that you have in the camera down to 200 as opposed to 100. So that's just another thing to keep in mind, especially if you like to use bright, fast primes on a sunny day. You're not going to be able to go down to 100 or that custom 50 mode that the camera has. So just be aware of that. But it is a cool feature to have. Anti-flicker is something that's been brought into the Canon camera system for a couple of years. If you're not familiar with it, if you're shooting in an environment that has pulsating lights, specifically things like fluorescent and sodium vapor and some LEDs, lights that have a spike to them. We don't see it with our naked eyes, but using a high shutter speed, the camera will see a difference between exposures because it's not capturing the full bandwidth of that light as it pulses on and off. So enabling this high anti-flicker shoot, the camera can recognize the flicker and it will time the release of the shutter for the peak of that flicker in the light. So this will help in creating more even exposures and more even color balance frame to frame when you're shooting in these scenarios that have flickering lights. I'm sure there's several folks on the call tonight that know that scenario of the old high school gym where you go in with the sodium vapor lights and you've got every bulb in the ceiling a different color, and you try and shoot it a 500th of a second in every frame, and is a different color and exposure. So this will eliminate or minimize that.
Tony, is that a good thing to leave on, or should you always just have it use it in a situation? If you use it on a normal day, will it mess up anything?
It's not going to mess up anything. So if you're not in any lighting environment that has a flickering or a pulsing light, it's not going to affect your photos otherwise. The reason you might want to keep it disabled is because it does affect the timing of the shutter release. So particularly for sports photographers that really get to know their cameras really well and can really, they're good enough to sort of get the ball on the bat because they know the timing of the shutter really well. It will change that slightly, and it will vary it depending upon the light source. So it's not going to do that in non-flickering light, but you may have scenarios where the camera detects a very slight flicker that's not really showing up in your photos to a great degree, but it will change the timing of the shutter release. So like a lot of other things, something to play with and see whether it's going to work for you or not. If you are in a really, really true flickering light source, as the warning tells you here, if you're using continuous shooting, it will slow down the continuous burst speed because it is going to be, again, timing the release of the shutter with the light source. So in mechanical mode, this camera will do 12 frames a second. You're probably not going to get that. You'll probably get something closer to, 8 to 10 frames a second as a guess, because again, it's messing with the timing of the shutter.
Yeah, I think you just answered Gary's question in the chat. He was just asking, is there a measurable latency for the shutter? I don't think for shutter speed, but for frames per second, it does affect, correct?
Yes, for frames per second. And so Gary, if you mean latency in terms of pressing the shutter and then the time it takes for the shutter to go off, yes, it will change that, because again, it's timing the release of the shutter with the lights. So good thing to keep off unless you know you really need it. So you're going to know you need it when you see that continuous burst frame and you see that variance in color and exposure. Just a note that this anti-flicker shoot does not work in the electronic shutter mode of this camera. We're going to end up talking about that in a bit. So anti-flicker only works in the mechanical shutter mode of this camera. Okay, I'm not going to spend really much time on any of these settings. These are all pretty much the same as the DSLRs. Your organization that you work for might have a preference for how you set your color space, whether it's Srgb or Adobe Rgb. Adobe Rgb is a larger color space. It captures a broader range of colors. I sort of use the analogy of, you know, Srgb being the 32 box of Crayola crayons and Adobe Rgb being the 128 box of Crayola crayons. You can kind of sort of draw the same picture, but with the bigger box, you can use more colors. So that's Adobe Rgb and Srgb. Again, this only affects JPEGs. It does not affect RAW files. If you're processing RAW, all of this is done afterwards. Same thing with picture style. Standard is the way the camera is set out of the box. That's not necessarily what everybody ends up settling on. I suggest that you play with some of these different picture style settings. The one that I actually like in terms of just overall colors is this faithful setting, because it's exactly as it says, very faithful. So this setting actually does reproduce colors a little bit more true to life than the standard setting. Then you've also got user-defined settings where you can go in and I can change the contrast and the saturation and things like that. So particularly for video, if you shoot a lot of videos like somebody like Jake, if you don't have a camera that has Canon log, or you don't want to shoot in Canon log, but you want a lower contrast look to your images, you can go in and set up a user-defined picture style and run the contrast down. And this isn't quite Canon log, but it will lower the contrast and sort of give you a wider gamut and wider dynamic range in your JPEGs and in your movies. So again, that's
I've used that before to make like a quote unquote fake log, you know, but a log on a budget, you know.
right. Yeah, and there's a couple of places online that will sell sort of Canon log-ish picture styles for different video uses, but something to try out, something to play with. But
Hey, Tony,
yes,
Dan is asking, is there a difference between faithful and neutral? Because all the numbers there are looking the same in that menu.
yes. So the numbers are the same. So what Dan is referring to is this set of numbers that goes alongside each of these picture styles. And so they correspond with these icons at the top. So, you know, for portrait, the sharpness is set on 3, 2, and 4, but the contrast, color tone, and color adjustment are all set on 0. But despite the fact that as we go through this, all of these settings on the right here, these 3 settings are all on 0, the overall color look does change with each of these different settings. So standard will look different from portrait, then landscape, then fine detail, neutral, and faithful. So neutral and faithful are sort of two that people sort of settle on, but there is a difference in the color. And again, my preference for just color fidelity, for colors that sort of look a little bit more lifelike, faithful is the one that I like to use. Okay. Clarity, I'll talk about real quickly. This was new. The first camera was the 1DX3 that had this, but it's now in the R5 and the R6. So if you shoot RAW format and you've played around with the clarity slider in Lightroom or Adobe Camera Raw, This is a very similar feature. It has a very similar effect to it. Again, this only affects JPEGs, but it can be useful in shooting scenarios, particularly something like, you know, a really hot summer day where you're shooting with a really long lens, a 600 millimeter, and you're trying to shoot through a lot of haze, and the image just looks really flat and sort of lifeless because of all that haze you're shooting through. You can run up the clarity, and it's going to increase the mid-tone contrast and put more separation in those types of images. So that's something you can try if you're in a scenario like that where you want to sort of, without affecting the overall contrast, so your shadows and highlights will stay roughly the same. This is just going to boost the mid-tone contrast so that it gives you more separation in a scenario like that. By the same token, running the clarity down has the opposite effect. It decreases the mid-tone contrast. And so one of the scenarios that works really well with this is portraiture, where you want to have sort of a softer, smoother skin tone. You can run the clarity down and it'll take that effect and sort of have a more pleasing portrait type effect. So again, something to play with, but you're going to want to leave that on 0 for you know, most of your work. Lens aberration correction I will mention only because of the new processors in the R5, R6, the 1DX3. We can now do this digital lens optimization in camera at 20 frames a second. So this applies the same sort of lens correction that you would apply in a raw conversion software, but now we're able to do it at 20 frames a second on JPEGs because of the processing power in these cameras. So just a very cool thing. And again, this is turned on by default. As I go through these menus, if you see a setting, this is the way it comes out of the box. And if I feel like changing it, I'll let you know. High ISO noise reduction. This is actually one thing that I recommend changing. The high ISO performance in this camera is so good. This camera and the R6 and the 1DX3, I actually recommend either disable or low on the high ISO noise reduction. Standard and high, for my taste, apply a little bit too much noise reduction to the luminance or the detail channel of the image, and it can start to look a little bit mottled. With high ISO noise reduction off or disabled, you get a really super sharp sort of film grainy look to the image, which a lot of people like. So I recommend either disabled or low as the setting for this. Low just applies a little bit of noise reduction just to smooth things out a little bit, but something to play with, something to see what you prefer. Okay. Focus bracketing. If you don't know what this is, you can set up a set of bracketed focused photos. So we know what exposure bracketing is. We shoot one at 0 exposure and then 1 or 2 at +1, +2, and then 1 or 2 at -1, -2. This is the same thing with focus, and the camera will automatically shift the focus according to these parameters. You have to play with it a little bit, but the cool thing is that on the back end, you end up with a series of photos that have the focus set from whatever your nearest point is to infinity. And then you can take these photos and put them in our digital photo professional software or other softwares that will focus stack them together. And so your end result is just incredibly long depth of field from near to far. So not something that you would necessarily use in a journalism setting, but there are some other creative uses for this. So I figured I'd point that out.
Can that be combined with exposure bracketing or not because of how many shots are happening?
It can. It's a lot of work on the back end. So you would, for example, even if you did a 3 bracketed range of exposures, that means that you would have to do 3 separate focus stacked images And then once those three are compiled and finished, you would have your 0, your minus, and your plus focus stacked images. And then you would take those three images and then put them through the HDR process to expand the dynamic range. So not impossible, but a lot of back end work. But, you know, for certain things could definitely be worth it.
Cool.
Interval timer for both stills and video is a really cool thing. It's an intervalometer built into the camera. So you can set your number of shots all the way up to unlimited, and then the interval of the shots. And, you know, if you wanted to do a time-lapse movie, you could take those still images and bring them into a video editor and create a time-lapse movie. So that's really cool that it's built into the camera.
Get another question on focus bracketing. It's asking, is that the same image or a group of images via motor drive?
So you're definitely going to have the camera on a tripod. This is not something that you're going to be able to do handheld. The camera has to be absolutely rock solid from frame to frame. So you set it up and you set your minimum focus. So it starts at whatever you determine the minimum focus is. And you can do that by selecting that using your AF point on the rear screen. And then you set the number of bracketed shots. So depth of field comes into play a lot here. If you're doing this with a wide angle lens, you're not going to need as many bracketed shots as you will with a telephoto lens or a medium normal lens. So it's something that you're going to have to play with and experiment with. And over time, you'll know that, you know, with this lens in this scenario, I'm going to need 25 images, or I'm going to need 50 images. 100 is a lot. Actually, 100 is a little excessive. Most of the experimenting I've done with this and the images I've done with this have all ranged between 5 and 25 photos. Then again, I haven't tried to do this with a 600 millimeter, which would be a real feat.
So that would be, if you're doing 100, that's like 100. That's 100 images being written to the card, correct?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. And then so that's 100 images that would have to be brought into the editing software. And you know, that would be a lot of pixel churning to make that happen. So it's going to take a lot of time on the back end to render that. But this is one of those things that you sort of have to play with, and is absolutely dependent on focal length and aperture. Okay, electronic shutter we're going to talk about here, or shutter mode. So we've got mechanical, first curtain electronic, and full electronic. So mechanical is what we're used to in a DSLR. When I set the shutter on mechanical, it's going to make a mechanical shutter sound, right? A mechanical shutter has two curtains, a first curtain and a second curtain. So in a normal mechanical shutter exposure, the first curtain opens to start the exposure, and then the second curtain follows after it to finish the exposure. First curtain electronic is a hybrid of those two. So when you press the shutter button in first curtain electronic mode, you still hear that that mechanical shutter, because you're using the second mechanical shutter curtain to finish the exposure, but the exposure is started electronically. So what's the benefit of that? Why would I use this over a mechanical shutter? So we talked a little bit a few minutes ago about shutter release timing. So in electronic first curtain setting, you actually get a faster response out of the shutter button, because that beginning of the exposure is started electronically. So you're not waiting for that mechanical motion to start. We're talking milliseconds, but it is faster. The shutter is a little bit more responsive. The other difference is that if you do a lot of fill flash, or flash where you need the maximum sync speed, first curtain electronic will give you a 2/50th max sync speed with a speed light, as opposed to mechanical, which is a 200th. So it's only a third of the stop, but that can make the difference when you're talking about balancing flash and ambient light.
Jake, did you find any of the electronic shutter very helpful? Did you use it at all?
Jake?
Oh, was that for me? I haven't taken any stills for this. I've only done video.
Okay.
Okay, and we're gonna get to some of the video features. I'm sorry, Stingray, you had something else to say?
Nope, that was it.
Okay.
I did. It was a very big shock whenever I came to the EOS R for my 7D Mark II, not having that kick. I kind of like the kick, but it's nice that it does fire faster without the mechanical.
Yep, absolutely. So full electronic, a lot of people also call silent shutter. It's actually called silent shutter in the EOS R. The engineers decided to make the change in the nomenclature because in electronic shutter mode, if you're not shooting with the lens absolutely wide open, the camera will still make a noise. You'll hear the aperture blades opening and closing. So the engineers at Canon are very conservative, and they didn't like the idea of really calling it silent because technically it could still make noise. So now we call it electronic as opposed to silent. But the good news here is, you know, the shutter itself is not making any noise, and we now get 20 frames per second out of the R5 and the R6 in the electronic shutter mode. So
Does the first curtain electronic shutter help with rolling shutter problems in sports?
it won't have any difference in terms of rolling shutter compared to the regular mechanical shutter. The only time you're going to see rolling shutter effect is with the full electronic shutter mode. So for folks listening that don't know what rolling shutter is, it's an effect that comes in with an electronic shutter because of the way an electronic shutter works. In very simple terms, it works very much like a flatbed scanner. You know, you put a piece of paper on your scanner, you hit scan, and you see that bar come across and scan your sheet and create the image. The electronic shutter works the same way, but obviously much, much faster. It does it in milliseconds as opposed to several seconds, but it's the same effect. So what happens is with very fast moving subjects, even if you're shooting at a 4,000th of a second, that rolling shutter effect, because of the time it takes to scan across the sensor, your subject could potentially move during that time and cause a warping effect. So the really typical effect that you'll see is, you know, someone swinging a golf club, and instead of the shaft being perfectly straight, it has a bend in it. And so the amount of the bend that you see in that shaft is directly related to the timing of the electronic shutter, how fast that scan happens. So faster sensors will have less rolling shutter or less of a bend. So talking specifically about Canon mirrorless cameras, the hierarchy in terms of say best to worst in terms of electronic rolling shutter, the R5 is at the top, having the fastest sensor readout and the least amount of rolling shutter, followed by the R6 and 1DX Mark III, and then the EOS R and RP. So if shooting sports with electronic shutter to get that 20 frame per second burst rate is something that's important to you, the R5 is probably the camera you're going to want to look at because, again, it does have a slightly faster readout than the R6 and 1DX Mark III sensors, so slightly less rolling shutter effect. Okay. Any questions? Because there could be a lot of questions on this before I move on. Are we good, Stingray?
I'm not seeing anything right now. Something might pop up later, but we can go back to it.
Cool. Excellent.
Jake, I know you have a hard out soon. Are there things you wanted to add before you had to?
Oh, me? Oh no, everything 27 is great. I think it's in one of the next slides. I love the the screen auto brightness. That was very useful today because I was going inside to outside a lot, and that auto brightness on the screen was super amazing feature to have in the
Under
camera.
auto brightness. Yep. Okay, we'll get to that in just a second, but yeah, this was something new in firmware 1.2.0, not the current release, but the release before it. This auto brightness people asked for so that the viewfinder would be proportional to the ambient light. You can also do it manually if you prefer, but you do have that auto brightness setting. All right, let me jump into the autofocus because this is where a lot of questions come in on this camera. The R5, the R6, the EOS R. The AF system is completely different from our DSLRs, so I want to go over some of this stuff right off the bat because I know there's probably folks that have a lot of questions. So right off the bat here, Servo AF, this is the same as what we call AI Servo in the DSLRs. It's for tracking moving subjects. So if you are moving or your subject is moving and you need to be able to keep that in focus, Servo AF is what you want. The other option is one shot, where that's a sort of one at a time, focus, fire the shutter, refocus, fire the shutter again. But most of the time, especially with the face detect plus tracking mode that we're going to talk about, Servo is what you want. AF method, we talked a little bit about this, the different options you've got. The power behind the autofocus system in this camera is this face detect plus tracking mode. So if I enable that and I now go into my shooting mode and I look at this family photo I see, you can see that immediately the camera has picked up on the mom and picked up on her eye and is automatically tracking her. So no matter where I move the frame, it's going to stay locked right on her. If I want to change to the dad, I can just tap on him and now it's locked on his eye, or the little girl. It just works that incredibly well and will just stay locked on. So for most of your work that involves photographing people, this AF method really works exceptionally well. And I'm going to get to how to configure this in a couple of different ways, including a way that allows you to move that AF point around while the camera's up to your eye. Subject to detect, you have people and animals. Animals is specifically dogs, cats, and birds, although it does work with other subject matter, but specifically those three types of animals. So when you enable animal priority, that head and eye detection that you just saw working specifically now looks for those three types of animals. Birders have really gone crazy over this animal setting because it really does pick up on birds' eyeballs. No priority is just that. It's not going to look for either type, but it's still going to use brightness, color, and luminosity or detail to determine what your subject is and stay locked on that. Eye detection we can turn on and off. So if I disable the eye detection, you now see when I go back to this family photo, it's no longer locked on the mom's eye, but is now locked on her face overall. So there might be times where you might not want to use specific eye detection, but overall face detection. And this also includes head detection in the R5 and R6. So specifically for sports where the players are wearing helmets or goggles, the head detection works really well as opposed to just the eye detection. Continuous AF, I just want to point out, this is not something that you should confuse with Servo AF. Servo AF is exactly what I said for tracking moving subjects. Continuous AF just turns on the autofocus and leaves it on all the time. So for stills applications, it's not really that practical. It tends to just run your battery down. There are some video applications where you would want continuous autofocus so that the camera is focusing and ready as soon as you're ready to roll your video. But for stills, you're going to want to leave this disabled because it is going to run down your battery. Touch and drag is something that came in with the very first Canon mirrorless, the APS-C mirrorless, the M5 years ago. This allows you to use the rear screen of the camera as a mouse trackpad sort of device while the camera is up to your eye. So if you enable that and then choose an active touch area, And this is going to depend on whether you use primarily your right eye or your left eye for looking through the viewfinder. That's going to correspond with which active touch area you're going to use here. You don't want to choose whole panel because inevitably your nose is going to touch the rear screen and you're going to be setting your AF point with your nose. So that's not a good idea.
Now,
But
is this available for both video and stills? These
Yes.
autofocus options?
Yep. Yep. Video and stills is the same, including this touch and drag that I'm showing you here. So that's one of the other powerful things about the R5, R6 EOS R. And I see that Jake had to leave us, but one of the reasons he shoots with the EOS R is because of that face and eye detection that he gets with the video mode of that camera. So real quick, my recommendation, if you are a right eye shooter, set this on top right, so that when you're looking through the viewfinder with your right eye, you can then drag your thumb across the top right corner and move your AF point around with your thumb. If you are a left eye shooter, I recommend choosing the bottom left corner, and then with your left thumb, looking through with your left eye, you can move around on the bottom left corner and move your AF point around. I can't demonstrate that here because I can't show you what the viewfinder shows, but take my word for it. It's a really cool feature and something that you can get addicted to very, very quickly. And this is, again, the R5, the R6, the EOS R, the RP, all of Canon mirrorless cameras have this touch and drag AF option. And particularly for the R and the RP that don't have the joystick multi-controller, this is a really fast and easy way to move your AF point around. And we're going to get to the joystick in a minute. Manual focus peaking and focus guide real quickly. If I enable the peaking and I switch the lens to manual, you can see now that the areas that come into focus have a red highlight around them. So this is a visual indicator of where the areas are in the frame that come into focus. The other cool option is this focus guide. This comes out of our cinema cameras. And when the focus guide is turned on, it uses the same face, head, eye detection that the AF system uses, but it now gives you a focus point to use manually in the camera. So you get this bracket and then you get these triangles, and as you move the manual focus ring, you see those triangles move, and when you nail the focus, it turns green and the triangles come together. So this is a great way to use eye detection with manual focus, particularly with lenses like our tilt shift lenses, which are really popular for doing portraits in super shallow depth of field where you've really got to nail the focus. This focus guide comes in really handy for scenarios like that. AF assist beam, particularly on the R5 and R6, but also on the ESR, I actually recommend turning off. This is the little beam that's in the front of the camera that will light up to help the camera focus in dark areas. But the amazing thing about particularly the R5, R6, they will focus in almost darkness. The R6 particular -6.5 EV, and if you don't know how dark that is, with a 1.2 lens, that's crescent moonlight. So we're talking really, really dark. So most of the time, the AF assist beam is really not needed and can be a distraction. So I recommend you turn that off. AF cases, if you're a sports photographer and have been using Canon cameras for a while, you may have sort of lived and died by these autofocus cases. You know, if you're shooting football, you swear on case 2, and if you're shooting tennis, you swear on case 4, whatever it is. And that's great. And you have some of those cases available in the R5, R6. But what's brand new now is this auto case. Because of the processing power in this camera, because of the deep learning in the autofocus system, because of the responsiveness of the dual pixel AF, you can now set this on auto, and it will change the tracking sensitivity, accelerate, decelerate tracking automatically based on how it sees your subject moving. And I know some folks might cringe when you hear about using any kind of auto setting, but please take my word for it. This is one of those auto settings that actually works and works really well. So try auto first. Okay, these settings are almost identical to our DSLRs, so I'm not going to go over all of them. I will point out in particular this new one with the R5 and R6 switching tracked subjects. So if you were an autofocus case user in our DSLRs, you might notice that there's normally 3 parameters here in a DSLR, where this camera only has 2. So that third parameter in a DSLR, the subject switching, is now moved to this menu item. So this is now independent of the rest of the cases. And so switching tracked subjects, I sort of like to refer to how sticky the AF system is. So at its most sticky setting, which is this 0 setting, it will tend to lock onto a subject and stay with it. It won't get easily distracted. For example, if you're following a soccer player across the field and an official runs in front of you, it won't easily get distracted by jumping onto that other person that comes through the frame. It will stay on your initial tracked subjects. Going the other way, switching subject is exactly the opposite. The AF system is more likely to jump off of what it thinks is initially the subject onto something that it thinks is a more appropriate or easier to track subject compared to what it was on originally. So this is something you have to play with. It varies with subject matter, and it actually also varies a lot by shooting style. So play around with this, but my actual recommendation to start with is the most sticky setting, this initial priority setting. I haven't had a lot of folks come back to me and say, no, that's not really working for me. So try that. In the interest of time, I'm going to sort of skip over most of these because they are the same as our DSLRs. And also because I want to spend a couple of minutes specifically on this setting right here, this initial AF point for face detect plus tracking. So out of the box, this is set on auto. So if I go back to my family photo, you notice that right off the bat, the camera has locked onto the mom as what it thinks is the appropriate subject or the auto subject. Hold on, let me, before let me enable the eye detection, forgot to turn that back on. Okay, so that may not always work for you. You know, if you're in a single person portrait scenario, that auto setting is going to work really well because it's going to use the face and eye detection, and it's going to see a person and it's going to lock right onto them, and it's going to work great. But if you've got multiple people in the frame, you know, what it chooses as the auto setting may not be the one you want. So if I go into this initial Servo AF point option and I choose this middle option, so this is AF point set for spot, single with surrounding points. What happens now is I start with a single AF point, the same as if I was in single AF mode in the camera. But the camera right now is still set for face detect plus tracking. But now I'm able to tell the camera what my subject is, right? So I can use this initial AF point. If I don't want to focus on the mom as the auto setting that the camera chose, if I want to focus on the girl, I can put the AF point on her face. And when I activate the focus, it's going to see that there's a face, there's an eye, and it's going to turn on all of that face detect plus tracking and go on to the subject that I want the camera to go on. So particularly for shooting sports, this is a really, really useful feature because you have the option of telling the camera what your subject is, what player you want to start tracking on. And so that is a huge difference, especially when it comes to following fast action where you've got multiple players. You know, you want the one with the ball. So you can put that initial AF point on that player and it will just track. So really important. That's a super important setting and really changes the way the whole AF system works for a lot of photographers. And so this is just one of those big settings. Put a big giant asterisk next to this one. On this menu, screen here, I'm also going to point out here sensitivity for AF point select. We haven't configured the multi-controller yet, and I'm going to get to that next. But when the multi-controller is active, you can use that to set your AF point. So if you don't use the touch and drag, if you prefer to use the multi-controller similar to our DSLRs, you can do that. And so this sensitivity setting sets how responsive the AF point moves when you move the multi-controller in one direction or another. So this is a personal preference thing. My personal preference is on the fastest or the plus setting. So let's get to that. I'm going to jump way ahead here. We're going to go into the orange menu in the third tab here under Customize Buttons. And so this is where we do exactly that. We can customize what different buttons on the camera do, and we're going to get to a few other things. But right off the bat, I want to scroll all the way to the bottom here. And for both stills and video under multi-controllers, I want to set this for direct AF point selection. So again, stills and video, direct AF point selection. So now when I go back to my shooting mode, I can now use my multi-controller to move my AF point around. So this is either on the rear screen or with the camera up to my eye. This is how you make the multi-controller move your AF point. So I have no idea why someone decided not to make this enabled out of the box. Seems like something that's a no-brainer to me, but you have to actually go in and turn it on. So that's how you do that. So once you have that on, you can now move your AF point around really, really quickly and really easily. And one of the cool shortcuts to the multi-controller, if you don't already know this from our DSLRs, is if the AF point is, all the way off to the side the way it is right now, if you push directly in on the multi-controller, it will center right back to the center of the frame. So a really great shortcut to get you right back to the middle and to be able to get your AF point on what you like. So another cool thing about the multi-controller, we're going to jump back now to this initial Servo AF point setting. If I put this back on auto, and now I go back to my photo here, you notice, yeah, it picked up on the mom, but now we've got these arrows here. So when the initial AF point is set on auto, the camera recognizes that it may not be selecting the subject that you necessarily want. So with the multi-controller active the way we have it now, we now have these arrows that show up. And when I move the multi-controller, I can not only move between right and left eyes, but I can also move between different subjects and then different eyes within those subjects. So if you actually like the way this auto setting works, by having the multi-controller active, you have this option when the camera sees multiple faces to very quickly jump around and choose the face that you want as your subject and as well as the eye in your subject. So that's a really powerful feature of the multi-controller that only becomes active when you go into the menu and actually turn it on. So again, another way that really changes a lot how the AF system works to make it more usable and easier to set your subject. Before we move off of autofocus, are there any questions on the AF system before we jump into a few other things?
There were no questions about AF. There's just some questions on sync speed and the electronic shutter.
Okay, sure, let's do that.
So what is the sync speed on the electronic shutter? Not the first curtain, but just electronic.
Yeah, so the quick answer is there is none. The electronic shutter is not usable with either dedicated Canon speedlights or studio strobes. With electronic shutter, you cannot use flash, period.
Okay.
So
And then
you have to use mechanical or first curtain electronic.
And then Josie's asking, so for sports, would you recommend using first curtain? He has the R5.
I actually would, yeah, because the first curtain electronic will give you that faster response time off of the shutter button, which some sports photographers really prefer. And in terms of what you're seeing in the image, we talked about rolling shutter. you're not going to see a difference in terms of rolling shutter compared to mechanical. So it's going to render your subject the same way the mechanical shutter will. The only other thing that's different with electronic first curtain and full electronic compared to full mechanical is if you do the kinds of portraits that involve a really fast prime lens, like a 51.2 and an 85.1.2, and you're really interested in the look of the background, that out of focus bokeh type of look. First curtain electronic and full electronic will actually change the look of that background bokeh. And so a lot of photographers actually prefer the mechanical shutter look when it comes specifically to those kinds of photos where your out of focus background becomes an element in the photo and the look of that is important. So just another thing to point out, if that's something you're doing, you might want to switch to full mechanical. And then Stingray, there was one other question.
No, that's it. I don't see any autofocus questions coming in. So whatever you have next, go for it.
Right. I'm going to just hit on this blue menu really quickly. There's one option particular to the R5 that you're going to want to set, especially if you're a sports photographer, and that's this rate button function. Again, out of the box, this is not enabled. It's one of those things you have to turn on. But if you set the rate button to this fourth option, protect, hold, record memo, you now have the same functionality as you have in our 1D series cameras of protecting the image or tagging the image, as well as leaving a voice memo. So for sports photographers, this is really huge, and this is an option that you're going to want to enable in the R5. Unfortunately, the R6, the EOS R, the RP, all of the other cameras don't have this record function. Only the R5 does. So that might be a deal breaker if you were on the fence about whether to get an R6 or an R5 and you're a sports photographer. This might be one of those features that is a, can't do without thing. Because I know as a former photojournalist that shot a lot of sports with 1D cameras, I relied heavily on the voice record function. So that would be a deal breaker for me. The other one I'll point out while we're on this screen is this magnification option. I like to set it from the default to the actual size from selected point. So what this does is I take a photo here, and when I go into playback mode, when I hit the magnify button, what happens is it will automatically magnify to 100% exactly from the point of focus. So this is the fastest, easiest way to see very quickly whether your focus is accurate, whether your subject is tack sharp. So that's another setting that a lot of people find really handy, is that magnification actual size setting. I'll just point out, just in general, just for all of our cameras, this highlight alert option, I like to turn that on. This will give you an easy indication if you've overexposed. So for example, I just shot this image overexposed, and you can see that the rear screen is flashing the areas that are fully blown out, that have no detail. So this is something, especially shooting on a bright sunny day, you can't really use the rear screen as a real judgment of where your exposure is. So if you're not going to use a histogram, this is a great way to get a really fast indication when you play back of whether your exposure is good or not. So that's another thing that I like to enable, is that highlight alert. I did a whole thing on Wi-Fi and FTP and everything, so that was 2 sessions ago. So I'm not gonna do that again. But I will point out, R5 and R6 both have built-in Wi-Fi. Both will do FTP from the built-in Wi-Fi, so that's really great. That's huge for both cameras. The EOS R does have built-in Wi-Fi, but no FTP. So again, that could be a deal breaker for you. The other thing about the R5 is that you have the option of not just the regular battery grip, but you have the option of the WFT R10 transmitter grip. So when you add that grip to this camera, you now get these 2 extra menu items in the second network tab. And one of them is the WFT settings. And so when you want to use the built-in transmitter grip, which does a whole bunch of things, not only does it extend your Wi-Fi range, but it also adds an Ethernet port. So that can be really important if you're doing remote work to have that Ethernet functionality. It also, if you attended my transmitting networking seminar a couple of sessions ago, we talked about the 1DX3 having multiple functionality through the WFT and Ethernet. So this camera will do the same thing. With the WFT transmitter, I can do FTP and EOS utility at the same time over the same wired or wireless connection. So if you're doing remote work, that is absolutely huge because you can access the EOS utility functions, set up the camera, your white balance, your focus, everything, and have FTP running at the same time. So that can be really huge. But this WFT settings emulates the same network connections now that you get in the 1DX3. So when you add the WFT transmitter grip, you get that full added high-end wired and wireless functionality that you get in our 1D series cameras. So just pointing that out, something that you might want to consider. Because the R5 and R6 will not only power through the USB-C port, so again, for remote applications, instead of an AC adapter, you can use a USB-C power adapter to power the camera, but you can also, when the camera's turned off, charge the battery in the camera. And so with the WFT grip, because the batteries are independent, one battery powers the camera, one battery powers the transmitter. When you charge through USB-C, you can decide whether you want to charge the camera battery first or the WFT battery first. So that's kind of cool also. So if you have any questions on the WFT transmitter grip, I'm happy to answer them, but I'm just going to move on. But it is a really cool, very highly functional thing to get for the R5. Doesn't work on the R6, just on the R5. Okay, I'm going to blow through some of these, but stop on some of them that are important. So, oh, you know what? Let me back up here. I'm going to jump way back here. I completely forgot. Shooting info display. This is really important. I wanted to point this out. I'm glad I remembered this. With the latest firmware update, if you have an R5 or an R6, but particularly if you have an R5, if you do not have firmware version 131, you're going to want to update to that for this one feature alone. Not only other things that come with it like Canon Log 3 and a bunch of other functionality, for this one feature alone, under shooting info display and screen info settings, I can set here when I cycle through my info options here, right? As I'm pressing the info button on the back of the camera, it's cycling through these different info displays, right? The latest version of the R5 firmware now adds this screen off option. And this is something a lot of photographers were asking for. And I call this screen off option the DSLR emulation option. Because now when I cycle through with my info button, I get to this one screen where there's nothing there. The rear screen is turned off. But the camera is now going to emulate the way a DSLR works. The rear screen is turned off. You don't have any information showing. But if you put the camera up to your eye, the viewfinder is still going to work. If I hit the playback button, the play is still going to work. If I hit the menu button, that's going to still work. But when I'm shooting with the camera, the rear screen is not on, and this is saving a lot of battery power. So I get a fair amount of questions on battery management with the R5 and R6. And with the R5, this is one of the biggest things you can do is enable this screen off option. And as you saw, again, it's not turned on by default. You have to go in and turn it on. So this is one of those things that you definitely want to turn on because it does save you a lot of battery power. While I'm in here real quick, if you do use histogram, you can change from brightness to RGB, and more importantly, you can change from large to small. So now when I bring up the info view that shows my histogram, it's not taking up as much real estate. So it's much smaller, not only on the rear screen, but in the viewfinder. So that small setting is really, really helpful with the histogram. Okay, sorry.
I have a question about that screen. If you want, if you'll go back, the copyright information setting.
Mhm.
Is there a setting that, or is Canon possibly working on finding a way to embed that information in a way that can't be changed or altered down the line? I know there's some things in the IPTC that are immovable and not changeable, but I've never seen copyright info be one of those things, and I'm wondering if that's something that can be, or is considered to be, or is moving towards being locked in.
There's actually a couple of initiatives right now. Reuters just finished one initiative. Some of you may have heard of the Starling project. That's basically blockchain for digital photographs. So it will preserve the provenance of an image as it goes through different steps of editing and publishing and so forth. So there's a couple of companies that are working on similar technology to what the Starling project was all about right now. That should be coming out, I would think, in the next couple of years. So, you know, obviously the first thing that we think about when it comes to these things is you know, fake news. So, you know, if a photo is published online, you don't know the history of that photo. You don't know whether that photo is real or fake. So with this initiative that's coming up, you'll now have that embedded information that shows the provenance of the image, and you can decide whether the image is genuine or not.
Yeah, Adobe is also involved in this content authenticity
Correct.
project.
Yep, absolutely. So Alicia, to your question, there's the EXIF information, right, which is actually displayed in the camera. If I go to the screen view, I'm sorry, it's in playback mode. If I go to the screen view that shows the histogram, this information on the bottom here is the EXIF data. And again, if I have my multi-controller enabled, I can now scroll through and look at some of this EXIF data that's embedded. This isn't nearly everything that's embedded, but it's some of the things that, you know, are important in shooting mode to see, you know, did I have the distortion correction turned on, or digital lens optimizer? Did I transmit the image, right? When we talk about sending FTP, this would display if the image was sent. So this EXIF data goes with the image when it's copied, and there's a lot of different programs, Photoshop not the least among them, that will, if you go into the file info, there's an EXIF tab for that, that will show you all of this data that gets embedded with the image. But this is just sort of, you know, raw shooting data, not what I was talking about with the content initiative and Starling and that stuff. That's a whole different thing that gets added on at the time of capture by a whole nother set of software. Does that answer your question? I'm sorry.
Yeah, but you're saying that, for example, if I programmed my name into the camera, that can't be put in as part of the EXIF.
I'm sorry. Yes. So there is an IPTC tab. I know we're starting to run out of time. So orange menu, fourth tab, IPTC information. So you can turn this on, and this is really cool because it will embed IPTC info in every frame. Sort of the downside of this right now is, in order to get that information into the camera, you have to connect the camera via USB cable to a computer, and then using our EOS utility software, you can then add that caption data to the IPTC data in the camera. So what I tell photographers to do is, at the very least, put in your name, your agency credit, those things that never change from one frame to another, especially if you're transmitting straight out of the camera. You know, when it drops into the FTP server, at the very least, if it's got your name and credit on there, they're going to know who made the photo, and at least be able to track down the rest of the caption information. You can add full Iptc data if you wanted to. For example, you could write a full caption in Photomechanic with all of the fields filled out. You can export that XMP caption file from Photomechanic, import it into EOS Utility, and then push it into the camera. So if you had the time and wanted to embed absolute full caption information, you could do that through this function here.
It's great advice. Thanks.
Yep.
I think there's a couple other questions. I don't know if Stingray wants to.
Yeah, so first question is someone who is going to be getting an R5S and wondering what the best practice for older EF lenses are for sports shooting, and they have the 400 f2.8 and the 300 f2.8.
So one of the great things about the Canon mirrorless system that really sets it in a lot of ways apart from all of the other mirrorless systems out on the market right now is the EF to RF adapter system. And so adapters have gotten a really bad rap over the years because traditionally they're adapting a Canon lens onto another brand of camera. And so, you know, Canon doesn't give the secret sauce to other brands that really drives our autofocus and makes it work really well. So things get lost in translation. So traditionally, lens adapters have not worked that well. Here, starting with the EOS R, the original full-frame mirrorless we came out with in 2018, the EF to RF adapter system works incredibly well because it's all Canon. It's got that secret sauce. And in fact, when you put one of the EF to RF adapters on any one of the mirrorless cameras, the brains of that camera go into EF autofocus mode. And those EF lenses are native on the mirrorless cameras, as native as they are on any of our DSLRs. And that's really important. There's also no optics in the adapters. So the bottom line is, you know, your f-stop doesn't change, your focal length doesn't change, your optical quality doesn't change, and your autofocus speed is just as good, and the accuracy is, again, just as good, if not better. A lot of folks have reported, especially with older EF lenses, that those lenses sort of come back to life and work really, really well on the mirrorless cameras because of the nature of the way the mirrorless autofocus system works. So there's absolutely no reservations in adapting any of our older lenses onto the newer mirrorless cameras. They just work, and they just work really well. And in fact, the lens I'm using here for this demo is actually an original 35 f2 that came out in 1987. That's how old this lens is on this camera right now. And it just works, you know, it just works really well. You can see the face and eye detection, everything works really well. The focus is really fast and accurate. So yeah, the adapters just work.
Awesome.
Okay, let me just real quick, just to point out a couple other things, just usability, functionality things while we're on this screen. This default erase option. I know for some folks, erasing in camera is sort of a no-no for the place they work for. Other folks don't have a problem with erasing in camera. If you do erase in camera, and I know, like, particularly when I used to shoot baseball, when you shoot every swing and, you know, 99% of them turn out to be nothing and you want to erase them anyway. If you set this default erase option, instead of where it is on cancel to erase selected, now when I go into playback mode and I hit the erase button on the camera, what comes up on the screen is not the cancel button by default, but the erase button coming up as the highlighted button to use right away. So if I want to erase the photo, all I do is just hit the set button on the back of the camera. So erasing becomes a really fast and easy 2-button operation. Erase, set, erase, set, erase, set, instead of erase, move from cancel to erase, and then set. It just takes out that other option and just makes things a lot faster. All right, while we're on this, customized buttons, customized dials, I just want to point out with these button settings, there's a ton of stuff you can do. I won't go into all of the different features, but just for example, the AE lock button, I'll scroll through here. These are all of the different things that you can program just that one button to do. And there's a lot of really cool features in here. If you're a sports photographer, this register recall function is really cool. It allows you to sort of switch between modes in the camera at the press of a button. It'll also allow you to, at the press of a button, once I get to it here, turn off the eye detection on and off. So if you want to go between the head detection and the eye detection, you can do that with the press of a button. One other thing I wanted to point out before we run out of time, before I forget, this is also really, really important. In the yellow menu here, hold on one second, because I didn't do this sequentially. I'm trying to remember where it is. Hold on one second.
Is it the sensor cleaning?
Sensor cleaning is one of them. So because on the R5, R6 EOS R, the shutter will close when you turn it off. Some people don't like to wait for that sensor cleaning time between the time you turn off the camera and the time the shutter actually closes, and then they can take the lens off. If you disable the auto cleaning, then as soon as you turn the camera off, the shutter will close, and you can change out the lens quickly. Now hold on one second. I apologize because we didn't do this sequentially. It'll come to me. With the R5, particularly with the new firmware, you can now save and load settings on the card. Again, this could be one of those deal breaker functions for you if you're used to using our 1D series, and if you happen to have more than one camera body, you're able to save or load the full settings of the camera onto the card. And what's really cool about the new firmwares now and the new cameras is these save and load settings also copy over all of your network settings. So if you set up a single camera for everything, how you want it done, and then also have your FTP servers and everything programmed in there, all of that is going to transfer over. You're basically cloning the entire camera over to the other one. And this is really helpful, again, if you've got more than one camera, or you've got a big event and you reach out to CPS and you borrow an R5 from CPS and you want to clone out that camera to match your other one, the save and load settings will do that for you.
Awesome. Now, we'll probably take maybe one or two more questions before we have to end the webinar, but put them in. Okay, Dan is asking, is save to card lost on reformatting?
Yes, everything is lost on reformatting.
Okay.
Yeah, so if you save to card, copy that file off to your computer before you format the card. Yeah.
And then Lawrence is asking, is there a difference between fast SD cards and CF Express cards for stills? Is there any usability differences? Do you unlock something by using CF Express cards?
You don't necessarily unlock something, but you do get a significantly larger buffer with CF Express because of that significantly faster write speed that CF Express cards have. So particularly if you're a sports shooter and you shoot RAW plus JPEG, with a UHS Type 2 V60 SD card, you get approximately 100 frame buffer on an SD card. With a CF Express card, you get almost triple that. So from a usability standpoint, just from the size of the buffer and the camera for stills, the CF Express card is going to be a big advantage just because of that write speed. So I found the thing I wanted to talk about, and this is also important, and I'm glad I remember. I know we only have 5 minutes left, but I want to do this real quick. Multi-function lock. This is something you're going to want to look at, and you're going to want to configure to your taste for a couple of things. Again, this is how the camera is set out of the box. What I like to do is, with this multi-function lock, also enable the other main dial. So this comes into play with the little lock button on the top of the camera. So when I press that, it says controls locked. And now when I try and move, something, it will tell me that the controls are locked. So one of the things I really want to point out in this function that a lot of people with the R5 and R6 have found really helpful is this touch control function. So if you do nothing else but enable this touch control function here, you have to make sure you go to OK to lock that in and enable it, right? People have complained that it's just too easy to touch the rear screen or have something inadvertently touch the rear screen and move their ISO into the stratosphere or move their AF point. If you only turn on the touch control and then you lock the controls, now the rear screen is locked from touch. So if you're not using this info option where the rear screen is off and you have the rear screen on all the time, having this locked control option will prevent you from inadvertently changing anything using the rear screen. So that was the one I wanted to point out.
Yeah, that's great. So Josie's asking, what was the setting for auto cleaning to protect from removing the lens by accident? That was just disabling it, correct?
Correct. Yep.
Okay.
So under sensor cleaning, instead of auto cleaning at power off, you can set it for disable. So the downside of that is you don't get the benefit of that ultrasonic cleaning every time the camera shuts off. So you may potentially start seeing more dust on the sensor because you're not auto cleaning. But this is a way to get the shutter to shut down right away as soon as you turn the camera off. The other shortcut to that is just to open the car door when the camera's turned on, and that will shut the shutter as well. So we've got 3 minutes left. Do we have any other questions? Otherwise, I thought of one other thing I could point out.
I think go ahead.
Okay. We talked a little bit about remote cameras, and this is also really important if you're going to use the R5 or the R6 as a remote camera. This setting becomes really important. This retract lens when power off, you want to turn that to disable. A lot of times with a remote camera, you'll set the focus, particularly with an RF lens where it's always electronic, and when the camera cycles off, it's going to want to move that autofocus back to infinity if this retract lens is set to on. You want to turn this off so that if you're powering the camera by AC and the power gets cycled, or between periods you shift out the battery and that power cycles the camera, you want to make sure this is turned off, because otherwise your focus will get set to infinity and you will lose that focus setting. So really important for remote camera work to have this turned off. Also, this release shutter without lens, if you happen to use, for example, one of our PL mount cinema lenses with an adapter that doesn't have the electronic contacts between the camera and the lens, the camera won't think there's a lens mounted on it and it won't fire the shutter. So this other option to enable release shutter without lens will allow you to do that. This also works with any non-electronic adapted lens. So I'm actually a fan of using, really old film camera vintage lenses on these mirrorless cameras. You can get third-party adapters for 10 or 20 bucks on eBay. They're really cheap and they work. So I actually use a lot of the old FD Canon film lenses and screw mount rangefinder lenses on these cameras because the back focus distance is so short. So in order to use those lenses, you've got to have this release shutter without lens turned on. And we are pretty much out of time. And I'm sure I forgot a couple other things, but I think I hit on most of the really important ones. So again, if there's no other questions, we're done.
Thank you so much, Tony. We really appreciate your insight. And these are some great tips for tweaking and making your maximizing this cool camera.
Absolutely. Yeah, my pleasure. Sorry, I'm trying to get my camera back here.
Nick had to leave us to get ready for an assignment, but we certainly appreciate his participation as well. Thanks everyone who's on the video or watching for your NPPA membership. We really appreciate your support. I wanted to let everyone know that next week, the NPPA live session is going to talk about Sony X400 and the A7R4. And we look forward to seeing you then. Thanks everyone.